Welcome to Truth Behind History. This is the channel where we dive deep into the moments that shaped our world, unpacking stories from the past and uncovering the truths you might not have learned in school. Today, we're venturing into the fascinating world of manorialism in medieval Europe, a system that once governed how land was owned, worked, and taxed. By the end of this video, you'll understand what manorialism is and why it mattered so much in the Middle Ages, how daily life revolved around these self-sufficient estates, and how this old system planted the seeds for modern ideas about property and society. Get ready for a journey filled with peasants, lords, and a whole lot of wheat. Now, let's step back in time to see how manorialism took root. We're looking roughly at the 9th to 15th centuries in Western Europe, after the mighty Roman Empire had crumbled. Power was no longer centralized. Instead, it broke into smaller, localized chunks ruled by all sorts of lords. Roads were rough, bandits roamed freely, and most people needed protection as well as a stable food source. Enter feudalism, a grand structure built on land grants, loyalties, and obligations. Manorialism became the economic engines of feudalism. Think of it as the daily hustle behind the scenes. From the fields to the manor house, everything revolved around producing enough food and resources to survive in a turbulent world. It was a time when your safety and your meals depended on close-knit relationships with your lord and neighbors. Before we dive deeper into the manor itself, let's lay out the nuts and bolts of feudalism. In simplest terms, it's a system where a lord grants land, known as a fief, to a vassal in return for loyalty and military service. This creates a neat little pyramid. At the top is the king, below him are powerful lords, further down are lesser lords or knights, and right at the bottom are the peasants or serfs. But feudalism's grand ideals come alive only when we zoom in on the practical unit, the manor. This is where local justice happened, food was grown, and resources were collected. In many ways, the manor was the real stage where feudal drama played out each day. So, what did a medieval manor actually look like? Picture a patchwork quilt of farmland, forests, and pastures stitched together around a manor house. The lord's personal land, called the domain, was worked partly by the lord's own servants or by peasants who owed labor. The peasants themselves often lived in a small village nearby. Think rows of modest huts clustered around a church or common well. Common areas for grazing livestock and gathering timber were shared by everyone on the manor, though they were typically controlled by the lord. Despite limited technology, this system was impressively organized. Each piece of land had a purpose, from wheat fields to apple orchards to the local mill. In short, if you lived on a manor, you rarely needed to leave it. Now, let's talk about who did what and who owed what. At the top, the lord was essentially the landlord, judge, and protector. In return, the peasants, often serfs, were tied to the land, which meant they couldn't just pack up and move. They owed labor dues, working a certain number of days each week on the lord's domain, plus they had to hand over a portion of their harvest as rent or taxes. Vassals, if present on the manor, typically held land from the lord in exchange for providing military support or administrative help. But the real foundation of the manor's workforce was the serfs. They might have had small plots for themselves, but they were obligated to farm the lord's fields first. It was a tough life, yet in a time of rampant insecurity, this system offered at least some form of stability and protection. Speaking of tough lives, let's look at the day-to-day grind. The economy here was mostly self-contained. Serfs paid rent in the form of crops or livestock if they couldn't cough up coins. They also owed labor dues, sometimes 2 or 3 back-breaking days a week, working the fields, repairing roads, or helping with seasonal harvests. On top of that, using the lord's mill, oven, or winepress often came with a fee. It might sound unfair, but in a world with minimal currency in circulation, bartering and paying in kind were pretty standard. Essentially, your bushels of wheat were your wallet, and your goats were your debit card. Despite these obligations, the manor had one major upside: it was remarkably self-sufficient. Food, wool, timber, you name it, it was produced on site. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers set up shop right in the village. Very little needed to be imported, which was good news, considering rickety roads and the risk of highway robbers. This self-contained setup was also a buffer against the chaos of medieval warfare. Kingdoms might clash, but life on the manor continued in its familiar rhythm of plowing, sowing, and harvesting. The slow pace of rural life ironically made for a kind of resilience to outside turmoil. But wait, it wasn't all about work. Religious holidays, saints' days, and harvest festivals provided moments of celebration and rest from endless labor. The church was often the manor's social nucleus, hosting not only worship services but community gatherings and even a bit of gossip. Women played crucial roles, too, managing households, assisting in the fields, and sometimes practicing specific crafts like brewing or spinning. Manor courts also settled disputes, from boundary disagreements to petty theft, making the local lord or his representatives the judge and jury for everyday issues. In that sense, the manor was a world unto itself, spiritually, socially, and legally. You might be thinking, this sounds nothing like modern property law, but surprisingly, bits and pieces survived. Customary obligations and local laws eventually influenced formal legal systems. Over time, as coin-based economies grew, peasants started paying cash rents, and labor dues became less common. After the Black Death reduced Europe's population, the labor shortage gave surviving peasants newfound bargaining power. Little by little, serfdom weakened, and the notion of personal freedom, along with property rights, gained ground. So yes, the next time you pay rent or read a property deed, you're brushing up against ancient manorial echoes. So, what do we take away from manorialism? First, it shaped how land was owned and worked for centuries, setting up patterns of economic and social hierarchy that lingered long after the Middle Ages. Second, it reminds us that societies can be surprisingly durable, even under constant threats, thanks to self-sufficient structures. Lastly, manorial customs paved the way for evolving ideas of individual rights and land ownership. And that's a wrap. If you found this exploration enlightening, and maybe a little surprising, be sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives into the past. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and check out our other videos if you're hungry for more historical adventures. Until next time, keep your sense of curiosity well plowed and well harvested.